The nets came up heavier than anyone expected. A single female, 136 kilograms, nearly 3 meters of bone scutes and ancient muscle, and she was carrying 28 kilograms of roe with no river clean enough to receive it. That was 1996. Scientists spent the next 27 years learning they had been protecting the wrong species entirely. Then, they released 100,000 juveniles into the Baltic in a single year. The project's true result won't be visible for another generation. She had been swimming the Baltic for 4,000 years. Not her kind. A lineage so old, it predates every border on the map beneath that water. That female in the net, 136 kilograms, was not a surprise catch. She was a last act, a reproductive machine with nowhere left to go, circling rivers that had forgotten what she was. I'm Dr. Raymond Finch. I have spent 30 years standing on riverbanks where the wrong decision was made long before anyone living could remember it. And this one is the most consequential misidentification I have ever documented. The Narva River had once received them in their thousands, sturgeons rooting the gravel clean, stirring the riverbed with their snouts, dropping roe into currents that had carried their young to the sea for millennia. What the researchers weighed and measured that day became the record: bone scutes, roe mass, body length, extracted from a fish no one would ever catch again in the wild. For the next decade and a half, European conservation authorities poured resources into protecting the wrong fish. They had listed Accipenser sturio, the European sturgeon, as the species to save. Then the DNA came back. Ancient bones pulled from Baltic archaeological sites told a different story entirely. The species they had been guarding was a ghost. The real native was American. Asking a conservation program to protect the wrong species is like fitting a lock to the wrong door. Every resource spent holds nothing. The Atlantic sturgeon, American by origin, had been the Baltic's own all along its bones. Were in the mud under these rivers centuries before any scientist drew a taxonomy chart. And here is what that error cost. A generation of scientists working to restore a population they could never have rebuilt because they were rebuilding the wrong one. In 2013, the first transport tanks arrived from Canada. Young Atlantic sturgeons, acclimatized in cold water and released by hand into the Narva. What happened next took decades to even begin measuring. The measuring took decades because the fish you release can only tell you what you need to know when it comes back. And nothing about those early sturgeons told scientists they had the question wrong from the start. For half a century after that, 1996 net pulled up empty. Every legal instrument protecting the Baltic sturgeon named the same animal. Accipenser sturio, the European sturgeon. Every breeding program, every habitat survey, built on that single assumption. The Soviets had tried to fill the silence decades before. They introduced Siberian and Russian sturgeons, exotic species from distant river systems, and recorded 73 individual captures along the Baltic coasts. Not one established a reproducing population, the Narva River, once a migration corridor wide enough to carry spawning runs into the interior, had gone quiet within living memory. The Pernu, a second historical spawning ground to the south, had been silent longer still. Along the broader Baltic, the bone record of archaeological sites carried fragments nobody had decoded. Those bones changed everything. Geneticists extracted mitochondrial DNA from ancient scutes and fin rays, pulled from Baltic archaeological sites, physical material that had been sitting in museum drawers for generations. The answer was not European, it was American. The native Baltic sturgeon was Accipenser oxyrhynchus, the Atlantic sturgeon, a species whose home range scientists had always assumed began on the far side of the ocean. What that discovery required was not a new fish. It required dismantling every assumption the recovery had been built on, re-evaluating centuries of taxonomy, sourcing Canadian and German breeding stock, and committing to releases across decades before a single animal would be old enough to spawn by 2022. The Life Baltic Sturgeon project was releasing 100,000, not a trial, not a pilot, into the Narva and Pärnu rivers each season. That is the scale the title promised. That is what commitment to the right species finally unlocked. The Life Baltic Sturgeon project secured €1,128,010 to fund that effort. A figure that sounds substantial until you consider what a single failed decade of protecting the wrong species had already cost the ecosystem in lost time. Each juvenile carried a 12.5mm passive transponder tag under its skin, and the larger individuals wore acoustic transmitters, small electronic devices that ping a network of underwater receivers as the fish move toward the open sea. The receivers log every signal. What they cannot log is what happens after the Baltic swallows them whole, because these animals will not reach sexual maturity for at least a dozen years. It's unlikely far longer. The receivers will go quiet. The rivers will look empty again, and nobody alive today can say with certainty whether those fish will find their way back. Long before anyone understood which animal belonged here, the Soviet state had already tried to fill the silence. Through the 1960s and into the 1980s, they opened tanks of Siberian sturgeons, Russian sturgeons, Bester hybrids, foreign animals dropped into a basin they had never evolved to read. Those animals moved through the Baltic, showed up in coastal nets, were logged and counted. Not one of them spawned. Not one established a self-sustaining line anywhere in the basin. The habitat that had once built a population over millennia had been stripped too far for a stranger to replace it. Three things had to be true at once for any release to mean something. The right animal, released at a scale the river could hold into a habitat that could receive it. The Soviet program got none of them right, and the effort that followed it repeated the first mistake in law. When European authorities drafted the EU Habitats Directive in 1992, they listed Accipensa sturio, the European sturgeon, as the species to protect. Every program built from that framework was, without knowing it, organized around the wrong name. A generation of conservation effort legally anchored to a ghost. 2 years after the DNA work finally named the right animal, Wildlife Estonia flew transport tanks in from Canada, 400 juveniles, 1-year-olds, each barely the length of a man's forearm, were acclimatized at the Narva bank and released by hand. That number was a proof of concept, not a population. Between 2018 and 2019, hatchlings bred from German stocks arrived. 50,000 animals entering the Narva in pulses across those 2 seasons. Melis Tambets of Wildlife Estonia stood at the bank as the last tanks opened in 2019, watching the water close over each fish. He knew, the way you know a hard arithmetic, that those animals entering the river that morning would not be old enough to return and spawn for up to 27 years. No management plan changes that number. No funding cycle accelerates it. Biology sets the timetable, and biology does not negotiate. When the full Life Baltic Sturgeon framework came into force in 2022, the scale shifted in a way the earlier pilots had never approached. Now, 100,000 move from the Narva and Pärnu into the Baltic each year. A number that finally matches the biology. Those animals are in the Baltic now. They root through the riverbed with their snouts, feel the current, and read water that their kind has not read here in living memory. Whether that memory is enough, whether a transplanted line can relearn a river it never knew, is the question the acoustic logs cannot answer yet. The ritual starts before dawn. Transport tanks, cold from the night crossing, are cracked open at the riverbank. A researcher lifts a juvenile, 2 hands, nothing more, and holds it flat above the surface. The fish is already reading the water. Its 4 barbels sweep the current below its snout. 5 rows of bony scutes, plates of living armour, press against the researcher's palms as the animal tilts toward the pull of the river. Before that animal enters the current, a needle delivers a 12.5mm transponder beneath its skin. A silent witness lodged between the scutes, pinging its position to a network of underwater receivers the moment the fish moves downstream. Some bury straight into the substrate. The receivers go quiet, others push on, the ping moving steadily downstream, out through the estuary, into the open Baltic. Following a migration corridor this species has not mapped in living memory. What the tags record is departure. What they cannot record is return. The receivers know when a fish leaves. They have no way to know if it comes back. I have stood on this bank. I have held fish like these, and I have understood, more plainly than any briefing document ever put it, that the work being done here will not be finished in my lifetime. Every season, 100,000 juveniles enter these 2 rivers. Each one carries a clock no researcher can fast forward. Decades of open ocean ahead before the biology even allows a spawning run. The scientists who tagged this season's cohort will have moved on before those fish are old enough to spawn. Some will have retired. The biology does not negotiate with grant cycles or political terms, but here is the thing the acoustic data surfaced that nobody predicted. Some tagged individuals are not heading straight for deep water. They are pausing, holding position in the shallow bends of the Pärnu for days at a stretch. Behaviour the monitoring teams have no clean explanation for yet. This is not a rescue. It is a bet placed across a generation. 100,000 bets laid into cold water every year in the faith that biology, given enough time and room, closes the distance between departure and return. The clock is running. The Baltic is waiting. And somewhere out past the estuary, tagged and moving, a generation of fish is doing the only thing science cannot do for it, growing up. That is the shape of this entire effort, reduced to its plainest physical law. A species built on a 27-year clock cannot be argued with, cannot be accelerated, cannot be incentivized to hurry. I have stood on enough riverbanks in my life to know that most of them do not come back. The female I stood over in 1996, 136 kilograms, 136 kilograms of armoured muscle, 2 generations of roe that never reached a river bottom. She carried the entire question. What the science settled is remarkable on its own terms. The wrong species was protected for 27 years, and when that error was corrected, the restoration shifted from impossible to merely very slow. But the physics of the ecosystem had already shifted the moment the juveniles entered moving current. Each one roots the substrate with its snout, stirs the sediment, pulls invertebrates from the riverbed, engineering the channel the way the species has always done without instruction. The Life Baltic Sturgeon project committed €1,128,010 to making that engineering possible at scale, knowing the first true proof cannot be photographed for a generation. That is the wager. Not a rescue, not a guarantee. A physical bet placed in cold, moving current that the animal, given the right river at the right latitude, remembers what to do. The question the monitoring teams cannot yet close: will these animals, grown massive somewhere out past the estuary, turn back toward the Narva and spawn, is the only question that actually matters now. Hundreds of thousands of juveniles have entered these rivers. The ecosystem they return to may hold them. Or the altered thermal currents and modified channels may prove the last barrier the species cannot cross. That is genuinely open. The scientists who study it say so plainly. Yes or no in the comments. Have you ever seen something come back that you were certain was gone for good? Because if the answer is yes, I want to hear that story.